Welcome to the Fall 2012 Dean Helen LeBaron Hilton Endowed Chair Lecture. My name is Robert Bosselman, and I serve as the Chair of the Department of Apparel, Events, and Hospitality Management in the College of Human Sciences. We are serving as the 2012-2013 host for the Hilton Endowed Chair. The individual selected for the Dean Helen LeBaron Hilton Endowed Chair is someone who is visionary and exemplifies the integrative, holistic, synergistic vision and themes of our College of Human Sciences in advancing the well-being of all people. Dr. Paul Wapner is a member of the faculty at American University in Washington, D.C., where he has served since 1991. He served as director of the Global Environmental Politics Program from 1998 to 2011. He holds both a MA and doctoral degree in politics from Princeton University, and he also has an additional MA in political science from the University of Chicago. He also studied at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Wapner's research focuses on environmental thought, transnational environmental activism, environmental ethics, and global environmental politics. He is the author of Living Through the End of Nature, The Future of American Environmentalism, and Environmental Activism and World Civic Politics, which received the Harold and Margaret Sprout Award for Best Book on International Environmental Affairs. And just for your attention, both books are available over to that side of the room, and Dr. Wapner will sign books at the end of the session this evening. And after his talk, there will be a short question and answer session. The microphone is in the center of the room, so please go to the microphone. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Wapner.
Well, welcome. Thank you very much, Bob. As part of my job as chair, I've been here now for since Sunday, and it's been a great experience. I feel like I even see friends now out in the audience here, and many of the students who I've spoken with. I'm really honored to be selected as the Hilton Chair. I think it's really visionary of somebody like Helen Hilton to think in the future and to invest in intellectual life. It's a strange thing to invest in, right? You don't see the consequences, you don't see the benefits for many years and so forth, as we know, being in a university. And so I'm really gratified. I'm grateful for that the position exists, and I'm very grateful to have been selected. I'm also very aware that you're here during the presidential debates. That's amazing, actually. I asked Bob to call the White House to see if they could switch the debates, but he said that would be challenging. So, as you heard, I'm a professor of global environmental politics. And what that means is I'm a part of a department that concerns itself with trying to understand what the causes of environmental harm are and what the mechanisms of response what they are and how they can respond to the severe challenges we face. What I want to talk about tonight within that is environmentalism. That is to say, we face dramatic challenges on the horizon. Not just on the horizon, they're already here. Climate change, loss of biological diversity, ozone depletion, freshwater scarcity. I'm sure you're familiar with the litany. What I've been concerned with in my research is looking at how do we respond to these issues? How do we organize ourselves politically? How do we use power to organize ourselves? And how do we address this both intellectually, psychologically, practically, and so forth? Certainly governments have a big role to play. And governments have done historically a lot, but I think any sober analysis of what's going on, certainly at the global level, would suggest that governments, if not are paralyzed on this issue right now, are very challenged. And so looking at environmentalism is looking at that response mechanism that exists kind of below the state, but across national boundaries, and how is this social movement organizing itself. And here I'm thinking of groups like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, World Wildlife Fund, Sierra Club, but also ordinary citizens and how we organize ourselves. Well, the point of departure for my remarks tonight is that environmentalism is many things. Environmentalists care about many things. But I would say at the heart of what they care about is nature. That is to say, the non-human world is the focus of attention, whether you're looking at climate change, loss of biological diversity, and so forth. The idea, as we're often told, is to protect, to conserve, to preserve, or to sustain the non-human world. Well, the talk tonight, what I want to suggest is that that enterprise of protecting the non-human world, that game is over. That's no longer what environmentalism can or should be about. Like it or not, we have failed as a movement to actually protect the non-human world from overly exploitative human activities. And I'll talk about that in more detail. And secondly, that the whole enterprise, I want to suggest, of actually protecting the non-human world may in fact be problematic. Now, I'm not the first person to sort of put this forward. It was put forward most famously by a journalist named Bill McKibben, who many of you may know. He's kind of a rock star now in the environmental movement. In 1989, he wrote a book called The End of Nature, and he was suggesting some of the things I'm going to be talking about tonight. So I want to talk about the end of nature for a moment, and I want to suggest that there's two elements of this. The first is an empirical element. So what do I mean by that? Well, for decades, population on the planet has been growing. Billions of people now. Billions of people with more access to technology, which allows us to intervene in the non-human world. Greater affluence, which allows us to kind of buy and get more stuff. You put those together. In fact, ecologists talk about an IPAT formula. Population times affluence times technology gives you a sense of ecological impact. But you put that together and you realize that we humans now, we're everywhere. We mine the crust of the earth. We fly through and pollute the skies. We fish and release substances into the waters. There's not really a place on earth that hasn't seen our signature on some level. And it's not simply that we have placed our presence throughout the planet, but we've actually gotten involved in the evolutionary process itself. What do I mean by that? Well, paleontologists, those people who study fossils. Is there a department of paleontology here? Maybe? No. Okay. Then I'm on sound ground because no one will say, no, you're wrong. The paleontologists tell us that if you go back in the fossil record, there were 5 great extinctions. The last one was 64 million years ago when the dinosaurs disappeared. Conservation biologists tell us today that the number of species, and I'm not talking about creatures, the number of species that are leaving the planet now due to human activities, the rate of that is equivalent to the last extinction. So we are in the midst of the 6th great extinction right now. And remarkably, what does it look like? It looks like this. People doing what they do just to sort of get by and live their lives, and a consequence is massive extinction. The conservation biologist Michael Soule said that evolution of higher vertebrae, he says, is grounding to a screeching halt because of human activities. So I'm suggesting that the first part of this, the empirical end of nature, is simply that we have extended ourselves far and deep and wide into the planet, across the planet that our presence is significant. The death knell of nature, though, in terms of the end of nature, as Bill McKibben pointed out, is climate change. Once you change the climate, you change all biological processes. So, for example, I'm told, someone told me today that in Iowa, the first frost comes a little later than it historically has done, and the springtime comes a little earlier. This is not just in Iowa, it's happening a lot in northern latitudes. Once you change climate, then, there's not a place on the planet that you can touch and say, non-human life or non-human presence. We can't even wake up in the morning. You can wake up in the morning and say, God, what a gorgeous day the earth has given us. Well, with climate change, we have to say, God, what a gorgeous day we've partially manufactured. Because, in fact, we're changing climate, changing temperature, changing humidity, and so forth. Geologists have renamed the geological period we are in, and they call it the Anthropocene, meaning that this is the period in which humanity has now become an ecological force. So, in millions of years, when we see that little, I guess we won't see it, but that little band of rock that will be when human civilization existed, that'll be known, well, it won't be known because we won't be around, but geologists tell us that that is the Anthropocene. That's what distinguishes our geological age. Talk about impact. Put that on your resume, by the way. Change planet. Now, that's the empirical end of nature, and I said there's a second piece to this, and that's the conceptual end of nature. So it's as if the physical wasn't bad enough, right? I'm going to bum you out by talking about the conceptual. It's a little trickier, but basically it goes like this. Most of us are used to thinking about nature as an independent realm, a realm that sort of operates on its own. And the empirical end of nature, then, is the intrusion into that realm. It sort of, if plants and animals are operating differently because of climate, it suggests that they don't just self-will themselves, they're partially influenced by human activities. The conceptual end of nature is not so much about intrusion, but it's that, how to say this, that nature is not something you can kind of just go out and find and say, here's nature. Nature's an idea that we use to tell ourselves about the non-human world. Let me put that differently. Nature is not something that we go out and apprehend in an unmediated way. Rather, it's something we project. We tell ourselves stories about. Think about, for example, think about Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau talks about wilderness as being a place of refuge, a place to kind of get out of the craziness of society. Well, 200 years before Thoreau, wilderness was like not a place of refuge. It was a place that was scary. It was a place that one got lost, both figuratively and physically. We see this today. I'm sometimes engaged in international meetings on environmental issues, and it's interesting. You go to these international meetings, and us environmentalists from the north go down and we say, we need to save these endangered species. And what do people from our colleagues from the south say? Some of them say, endangered species, those are our dinner. Those are our resources. And we could say that's just semantics, but actually it's fundamentally a different world we live in. And so what I'm suggesting is that our ideas of nature have changed over time and over place. In short, nature is a social construction. Now, that's not to say, and actually I want to be really clear here, I'm not saying that I'm not saying trees don't exist or that mountains don't exist. What I'm suggesting is that the meaning of those things is a matter of social convention. As they say, they often say, drop a brick on a postmodernist's foot and it still hurts, right? But the meaning of the hurt is what we're talking about. So, So that's the context. That what I'm suggesting is that nature, this thing that environmentalists have sort of cared about, protected, worked to sustain, and so forth, it's been the measure, really, of environmentalism. We've had this notion that anything then that nature is this standard, and anything that sort of moves away from it tells us how much environmental degradation there's been. So we have a notion of sort of what a pristine ocean is like, and its degree of pollution is always in contrast to that notion of nature. Well, what happens to a movement then when that's no longer possible? What happens when the ground falls out of environmentalism? Are you with me? Does that make sense? Yeah, no? All right, well, you could just hum. No. I was trying to think of an analogy, actually, because I've met some fabulous scholars here and students and so forth, and I was trying to think of, let's say, in the apparel business, if the fashion industry, which has to do this all the time, what happens if the idea of fashion fundamentally changes, which it often does? Or hospitality management, what happens if that sense of if the discipline is based on sort of accommodating people and being kind to people, and as if someone came along and said, you know, this whole idea of kindness and accommodation doesn't make sense anymore. That's somewhat the analogy to what I'm talking about with environmentalism. Well, so people have been, as I said, I'm not the first to sort of bring these issues up, but people have responded to them in two ways. Some people say, look, this is all well and good, but you're just an academic and you live in an ivory tower and you love abstraction, and you would do very well to get outside every once in a while and see that nature does exist and so forth. And there's a sense in which this is just academic irrelevance. A second response, though, has been people find this argument dangerous. If there's no such thing of nature, I mean, anti-environmentalists love this argument. No such thing of nature? Pave the rainforest. You know, if there's nothing back there worth really that we could sort of identify and say that matters, then human beings can do anything. And these two responses have sort of had environmentalists pretty hesitant to engage this issue, to engage the end of nature. But what I want to argue is that I think it's actually an amazing opportunity. It's not the death knell of environmentalism. Actually, it's an opportunity to regenerate the movement and to think afresh about it. In my view, environmentalism is not doing very well in this political climate. It's fighting for its life in many ways. And I think part of this, just part of it, I don't want to blame a lot on environmentalism, but part of it has to do with its own anachronistic or its own subscription to an anachronistic idea of nature. So I want to suggest that the end of nature actually allows us to reframe environmental politics. And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about. How can we reframe environmental politics to make it more powerful, more perceptive, and more politically relevant? And to appreciate this argument, I want to place the discussion in the context of environmental politics more generally. Now, environmentalists and their critics argue about a lot of things. They argue about how much CO2 the atmosphere can handle. They argue about land use. They argue about the value of biological diversity and so forth. But at bottom, I think if you scratch the surface of the arguments about environmental politics, I think what you'll find is a disagreement, a fundamental disagreement about the place of humanity on Earth. Environmentalists tend to see human beings as just another species, and therefore a species and an organism that has to pay attention to ecological imperatives. we can put lots of CO2 into the atmosphere, we can dump lots of things into our waterways, but sooner or later, nature's going to speak, and when nature speaks, it's sovereign, and, we either listen or we suffer. And so if that's the case, then environmentalists say what we want to do is we want to respect nature and harmonize our lives with nature, and organize society so that it's respectful of the limitations of nature and so forth. And in the book that I published, I call this the dream of naturalism. That environmentalists subscribe to a dream of naturalism. That is to say, we are natural creatures and we should take our cues for living from the natural world. In contrast to this, critics of environmentalism don't see human beings as just another species. We are the exceptional species. We don't have to really listen to nature's imperatives. We can outsmart nature, and in fact, we do it all the time. In fact, the end of nature itself is a demonstration of how incredibly, innovative we are, and how technologically gadgeted we are, that we can actually lord over the natural world. And in the book, I call this, to contrast it with naturalism, I call it the dream of mastery. That many anti-environmentalists or critics of environmentalists, they just believe that human beings can master all this stuff, and we don't really have to worry. And that this mastery comes from our own nature, and human beings, our nature is technological, innovative, creative, and so forth. Well, the end of nature argument says that these two categories, these two dreams really, no longer make sense. It's time to give up on the deities, the kind of grounding of each of these. There is no pristine nature out there anymore. And we don't know what nature is. In and of itself, all we know is the cultural stories we tell ourselves about it. But likewise, it's the same with human beings. We don't really know what human nature is about. We can't say definitively that we are a technological being that sort of realizes itself when it controls nature. That's, again, another story about the human being. So, in short, what I'm suggesting is that environmental politics has been sort of this disagreement about humans' place in nature, and that's changing, or it has to change. And actually, I think it's liberating that it has to change. And I want to argue that there's a middle way to go that doesn't subscribe to either of these, and that's much more relevant for today. And let me just give two examples of this, and then I'm going to... I didn't start my watch, but I think I'm doing okay. At some point, the cane will come out and grab me, but you got my back. So I want to talk about it first in terms of, so what does this mean? I want to kind of put it in a real life context. And in fact, one of the things I've been really impressed with about this university is that it produces cutting edge knowledge, but it really links that knowledge to practice and to practical affairs. And I've never been good at that, but I'm going to try to do that a little bit here. So what does this mean? Well, let me talk about what this would mean in terms of wilderness protection. Wilderness protection has been important to environmentalism since its very beginnings in the 19th century, or whenever you want to sort of locate its beginnings. And basically it's about protecting or preserving gorgeous areas that are untouched by human beings. And I want to quote, this is how the Wilderness Act of 1964, the United States Wilderness Act, defines wilderness. It says, wilderness is, quote, an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man is a visitor who does not remain. I'm going to read it one more time. Wilderness is an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man is a visitor who does not remain. This image of wilderness, which is sort of at the heart of this dream of naturalism, has produced a orientation of protected wilderness which a lot of people call reservation conservation or fortress conservation. The idea is that what we do is to sort of protect a wilderness area, we surround it, we lock it up, we keep human beings out, and we protect it for its own integrity so that wilderness can be wilderness, it can be wild, it can be untamed, and so forth. Well, I would challenge you to point to one place on the planet where that's the case. We don't have wildness per se. What we have today is managed wilderness. If you go to any wilderness area throughout the United States, what you'll find that there are managers who do lots of different things. Sometimes they feed animals in the winter. Sometimes they reintroduce species. I was just in Nepal. I've mentioned this to a number of people, and I was down at a national park, and we were riding elephants. It was actually quite cool. Riding elephants. Now, they weren't exactly wild, right? Because we were riding them. So we had these tamed elephants, and we were out there looking for rhinos. And it was pretty crazy, actually, because they're so committed to showing you rhinos that one of the elephant people will sort of say, "Oh, spotted a rhino, 40 degrees left." I don't know what they're saying because it was in Nepalese, but they were saying something like that. And then all the elephants would kind of, and they'd kind of find the rhino. And this crazy thing is, you'd surround the rhino with like 10 elephants. And I was thinking to myself, surround a rhino? Is that a good idea? But they didn't ask me. But what was interesting was when we saw the rhino, right, it had this amazingly big collar on. And I was assuming that the collar allowed them to track it. Now, this is wildness here. I am in a wilderness area in Nepal, which gets very few visitors, and yet the rhinos have names. I guess they have numbers or whatever. But I mean, it's interesting that it's managed. And I would say the same thing about wilderness areas throughout. When you talk about managed wilderness, it sounds like an oxymoron, right? Once you start managing wildness, it would suggest that wildness doesn't quite look like it used to look. Moreover, in every case in the United States where you have a national park or a wilderness area, not in every case, in almost every case, they started by kicking people out to create the wilderness. Grand Canyon's a great example. So what I want to suggest is if we take the end of nature seriously, if we take that seriously and recognize this problem of wilderness in this case, it'll allow us to see that, first, the blurred lines between humans and nature, but also that wilderness may not be about protecting nature from humans. Wilderness may not, in fact, be a place or a condition. Rather, I would suggest that wilderness could be a relationship. Now, what do I mean by that? It's interesting. Native Americans, if you talk to some Native Americans about wilderness, they will very much talk about relationship. For them, if you just leave the land alone, they'll say it will go fallow. It needs us. And so what Native Americans often do, not just for productivity, but for the well-being of the land, is they'll plant plants, they'll plant tobacco, they'll plant potatoes, they'll plant other species to keep the ecological abundance of a place alive. They'll clean salmon beds for the salmon to go upstream. It's not a type of protection where they remove themselves and say, let's get human beings out of the picture and let wildness be wildness. They say wildness is about us participating and cultivating a relationship. The end of nature, in my view, invites environmentalism to let go of this anachronistic dream of wilderness and of nature, and I think allows us to have different ways of cultivating ecological well-being. And I just want to say one thing in parentheses. I'm not saying, therefore, let human beings go everywhere and let's get rid of wilderness areas and so forth. What I'm suggesting is that the nature of what a wilderness area is much more complicated, and it requires a different kind of way of dealing with it. Let me just say briefly something about climate change, and then I'm going to wrap up. Mark Twain. Mark Twain had this great line. Mark Twain's got great lines, but one of his best lines I always thought was, he said, "I never let my schooling interfere with my education." But you should remember that after you graduate. He said, but he also said, everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. What's interesting today is that we're actually doing lots to the weather, but we're actually not talking about it that much. I would love to see in the debates tonight how many people are talking, how much the candidates talk about climate change. It's been very, very sparse in my reading up till now. And had they been here, maybe they'd talk a little more about it. So we're changing the weather, we're changing climate. And conventional environmentalism basically frames the problem as human beings should get out of the greenhouse gas business. We should get out of the atmosphere. And we should take that divide between humans and the atmosphere and make it as wide as possible to protect the atmosphere, which is nature, from human beings. Basically, leave it alone. Well, as you know, the way we measure carbon concentrations is parts per million. And we know that pre-industrial levels were about 270 parts per million. Today, we're at what, 395 parts per million and growing? What would it mean to get out of the atmosphere now? What would it mean? In fact, in 1988, when James Hansen, who works for NASA, is one of the most important spokespersons on climate change, when he first publicly came out and concerned about climate change, we were way past the 270 limit or number, and no chance of getting back to it. And in fact, the most aggressive international treaty doesn't even have that in mind. It's not about getting back to nature or a natural way that the atmosphere always was. That's a dream. It's something else, and that's what I want to suggest. It's not about getting out of the atmosphere. Actually, it's about getting in the atmosphere in more creative ways. It's come to the point where, to address climate change, we need to be planting trees. It's not about getting out. It's not about doing nothing. We need to be planting trees to soak up carbon. We need to be using high-tech capabilities to build solar, wind, geothermal types of energy systems. We need to, sadly, mitigation has only gone so far. We're going to have to, sadly, adapt to a warmer planet. Especially, I think about in Iowa. I read the paper today, and I'm not a proponent per se of biotech seeds, but I understand that basically 90% of seeds used, 90% of agriculture in Iowa is biotech. And there was a quote by a farmer today in the paper who said, "Thank goodness I used biotech during this last summer, given the drought." And my sense is, and this is not an endorsement for biotech agriculture, but what I want to suggest is that Iowa farmers are not only seeking a cooler, less drought-driven climate, but they're also planting for a warmer world. They're adapting. And I want to suggest that we realize this and develop this relationship with our new planet rather than pretend that it's the same planet. Bill McKibben's new book is called Earth, E-A-A-R-T-H. And he spells it that way because he says, we live on a different planet. This is not the place that we thought we were living on. This planet is human through and through. And until we realize that, how sad it may be, we're actually going to be going in some wrong directions. So let me wrap up. Let me say what I'm trying to pull some of this together here. And I want to say one other thing. I consider myself an environmentalist, so this critique of environmentalism comes from actually a very personal place for me, that it's not I do this because actually I love the movement. And the critique comes because I think the movement could be more powerful. And what I've been suggesting is that environmentalism for a long time has spurned human intrusion. It's looked skeptically at technology. It's looked skeptically at human activity. It's actually in some ways been misanthropic, or certainly parts of it have been. It's seen this divide between humans and nature and has seen its job as staffing the barricades to make sure that humans stay out. Well, what I've been suggesting is that that's no longer possible. We live in a hybrid world, a co-evolutionary world. Neither can we let it be. It's sort of like colonization, right? You colonize a bunch of people and at some point you say, oh, you're free, go off, as if you're no longer involved. So we can't sort of just let nature be anymore, but neither can we lord over it with this arrogant, hubristic notion that we know what's right. So I want to finish by offering a metaphor for what I think environmentalism after nature can and should be. As too many of my colleagues have heard me say this ad nauseum, but I have a daughter. I'm a parent. My daughter actually started college this September. I have 2 children. Reflecting on parenthood, I think can be used as an analogy to think about the more than human world. And when you're a parent, you do 2 things, I think. You probably should do many more than 2 things, but you do at least 2 things. One is, I spend a lot of time molding my kids. I tell them what I think they should read. They don't listen, but I tell them what they should read. I tell them, I work hard to try to give them a value system that I think is worthwhile. I try to entice them to be interested in things. Actually, I do have this memory of my son. When he was in 6th grade, he came back and he had to join a club. And there was a list of clubs that he had to join, and one was called the Ecology Club. And he pointed to it, and he pointed to me. He says, "Not going to do that one, Dad." But anyway, that's just the limitations of my ability to mold him. But I'm still working on him. But so I mean, one thing a parent does is they mold. But the other thing a parent does is they also recognize that a kid has its own way of being as well. And so we both mold and we behold, and we step back and say, wow, you are a freaking amazing entity. I wouldn't call my son an entity, but you are an amazing being. And it's that back and forth dialogic relationship that I think is so important to raising a child, but also to relating to the more than human world. Look, there is definitely a world out there that's more than human. And we are implicated in its activity. And we can't just get out. That would be like telling my kids, good luck. I'm sure they'd love to hear that, but they're not going to hear it. Because, and I would say it's the same thing with environmentalism. We can't just say, let it be. So we have to mold it, but we also have to behold it. And I would suggest that environmentalism after nature recognizes that important responsibility and that important limitation on that responsibility to both be marvel at this world and to recognize our responsibility to make it healthy, ecologically sound, have just relations toward it, and so forth. And so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Question and answer period, and again, the microphone right here in the middle. And please direct the question to Dr. Watts.
Those of us who hold the environment, the natural environment, into our education, with youth and families and communities, how might you suggest that we change our curriculum and the kinds of messages that we need to fit what you're suggesting?
Great. I'll just repeat the question because I don't think the microphone was on. The question was, in short, how would we change what we teach and the curriculum based on what I'm suggesting. Well, I should say this. I think that environmental education, what I'm learning at this college anyway, is that sustainability is disseminating into all kinds of disciplines. So it's not just how do we reteach environmental science, but how do we teach, fashion design and so forth. What I'm suggesting is that, I guess, two things. One is to not necessarily repeat or keep encrusting this notion that there is this thing called nature. Nature knows best, and our job as human beings is to read as carefully as we can what nature says we should do and assume that our job is done. I think that's it's a beautiful image, and I think it adds a lot. And I mean, certainly natural science is about understanding the natural world and picking out patterns and so forth. Interestingly enough, much of natural science, certainly in terms of modernity, has been about figuring out that pattern so we could figure out how to get around it and outsmart it and so forth. By virtue that we can sometimes get outside of it and outsmart it, would suggest that nature's laws are not always inviolate, that they can be transgressed. In fact, we transgress them all the time. And so I would suggest that education recognize that fact and not project a kind of mythic image of sort of the God of nature and we are its supplicants, but to recognize that it's a relationship. The other piece of this, though, is that so much of environmental education, and maybe I'll speak to this just specifically because I teach environmental politics, it's so much of it's doom and gloom. And I teach a course called International Environmental Politics. I think I mentioned this to some students. My students have renamed it Introduction to Doom, because each week, I say, okay, let's talk about climate change. And you think you're bummed out, let's talk about freshwater scarcity. And then we go down the line, and in 14 weeks, on week 14, and this is not me, but my discipline, week 14, we always say, it's really terrible, but you can make a difference. Have hope. It's like Al Gore's movie, It's sort of like at the credits was the time where we said, what to do. So I actually think that environmental education has a responsibility to move beyond doom and gloom. And I think to empower, not in a Pollyanna way, but to empower our students to see the way the world is and the predicaments we're in. And I actually think a recognition of the end of nature, as sad as that sounds, can be a liberation from that. And it can suggest that not every environmental battle that is lost is another nail in the end of the world. But actually, it's more complicated than that. And that that some people suffer and some people win when there's change. And that I think recognizing that we're in a relationship with the non-human world rather than it's here and we're there, I think can assist in moving beyond a doom and gloom world.
I was wondering your input on the vegetarian diet, talking about like in Europe they have olive trees that are thousands of years old, yet we are eating meat here that we eat corn and soy that's only grown a few months, and we think it's very nutritious. What's your input on a subject like that?
On vegetarianism?
Yeah.
Well, what does one say? I'll speak personally and then I'll speak professionally, as it were. I actually was a vegetarian for 15 years, and I got married, and my wife said to me, "Do you want to eat together or not?" And I love my wife, so I said, "We'll eat together." And so now I actually eat chicken and sometimes fish. So that's my mea culpa. That's my admitting. It's very clear, though, if we're into sustainability, and sustainability is not just about nature, right? It's about economic well-being, it's about social justice, and so forth. I think there's no question that we could feed more people and have more resources around if people ate lower on the food chain and if we ate less meat. And there are movements out there. Some campuses, I don't know if this campus has it or not, but I know many campuses have meatless Mondays where they encourage much of the campus not to eat meat one day a week. I think we can certainly, again, feed more people, use resources more wisely if we ate lower on the food chain and ate less meat. Interestingly enough, what's happening in the world, though, is as China and India and countries that are developing, as they grow in economic capacity, we know they're eating more meat. They can afford it. And just add up the numbers, if you just want to do it in terms of water, or if you just want to do it in terms of carbon, it's pretty significant. Now, does that suggest that vegetarianism is the only way to go, or is the way to go, or is the answer? Sadly, I don't think there is an answer. I think that these issues are pretty tragic, frankly. And I think that it would be great if everyone was a vegetarian. It still wouldn't solve all our problems, but it would buy a lot of leeway. But we also have to ask the political question. Is it more efficient to try to reacculturate the world to eat less meat, or is it also or is it also useful to think about ways of cultivating crops differently, of treating animals differently, of figuring out ways to get off of fossil fuels in general? And so I would say that it's an important component. As a social scientist, one would say it's necessary but not sufficient. So, and I will say this, at a personal level, it's tough for me now. Now that I eat some meat, maybe. Well, no, I was going to make a joke and say, when my wife and I break up, maybe it will be different. But I hope that never happens.
First of all, I would like to say thank you so much for coming and talking. I think this is a really important dialogue to have. And along with this being election season, I have been very frustrated with the fact that in politics, environmentalism, like you've been talking about, isn't really talked about at all. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were on what it will take for countries to take a greater stance on participating in nature the way you've been talking about, or if you think maybe it should be more a grassroots effort rather than a top-down approach.
Okay, good question. These are all good questions. I think that my understanding of power in the world is that different institutions, different organizations can utilize power in different ways. There's no question that governments, I'll put it this way, the state. Max Weber, the sociologist, defined a state. He said that the state is an institution which has a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence in a given territory. Now, I know that sounds abstract, but basically it says that a state has an ability to use coercion to get people to do stuff. And that goes a long way to shaping behavior. You pass a law, you threaten people with violence if they don't follow the law, which is ultimately what we do, right? You have a law and you get a traffic ticket, you don't pay it, and you blow it off, and you pay a fine, you don't pay a fine, or whatever, and eventually they've got guns to make us do certain things, and hopefully it's legitimate. But I think governments can do a lot. But I think that in this political climate, especially during a time of economic recession worldwide, there is this, I think, misperception that environmental well-being and economic well-being are at loggerheads. And what that has done is it's basically pushed the environment to the side in terms of public discourse in a big way. And I think that's again, a misperception, because I think that there's no question in my mind that you can have economic well-being and environmental well-being. And in fact, I don't think you could have one without the other. But having said that, I think that there are powerful economic forces right now that are also working to belittle the voice of environmentalism. The petrochemical industry is huge, and they're putting tremendous efforts into campaigns about climate change. And in fact, their effort is not to say climate change doesn't exist. What they're trying to do is just sow a little bit of doubt and say the science is not definitive. And they've been very successful. And amazingly, in this country, more than most countries, and I think the only explanation for that is because they're so powerful here. And given the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, where now money can sort of run elections, I think that again is this kind of monster in the room that keeps the discourse about environmentalism to a minimum. What can be done about that? I think that what can be done about it is that people who see a different world, both in government and out of government, need to continue to speak up and need to organize and need to recognize and need to find arguments, both moral, economic, and ecological, that can actually gain in persuasiveness. We're in a strange time now. I'm convinced, actually, that the polarization in politics that we're in now, it's going to be with us for a while. It's not going to last. I think that the ecological realities and the social realities are going to get very profound. And I think things may get worse before they get better, but I think that I was just in Nepal, and I mean, Nepal contributes a fraction of a fraction to climate change. Almost all of its energy comes from hydroelectric. Yet it's at the forefront, and it's one of the poorest countries in the world, yet it's at the forefront of climate change suffering. The glaciers are melting. They've had droughts these past few years, which have actually, and we're talking 90% of agriculture in Nepal is rain-fed. It's not irrigated. And these are subsistence farmers. So when this weather changes, they feel it. And so I think that as those realities grip us more, I'm hopeful anyway that we'll be less about who's in power, and it'll be more about what do we do with power. But I also think that would be beyond the state as well. So, but you've asked the $12 billion question, and I would say this is what global environmental politics stays up late at night thinking about, and sadly still struggles with.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Ask an easy one, like, what college are you visiting now, or something.
Paul, I'll ask that question. What's the one takeaway you want the students to go away with from your talk?
Well, I'm going to do the academic thing and say there's two. The first is that, I'm very aware that I've put out sort of a conceptual philosophical argument tonight that was fairly abstract, and I apologize for that on the one hand, but I did want to share with you sort of what in my mind, some of the more innovative thinking that's being done in environmental political thought is wrestling with. So part of it's an intellectual message, and that message is that nature, the nature of anything, including the nature of nature, is something which is contingent. We've known this, we sort of, whether it's the nature of sanity and insanity, whether it's the nature of heterosexuality and homosexuality. We as societies, we always normalize things, and we always think we know what the nature of something is, and whenever we do that, we do violence. And so what I'm hoping in the abstract is that students walk away and recognize that even environmentalism, even something that is committed to protecting nature, it's a lot more complicated. But the second thing I would feel remiss if we ended the night without saying this, is that that environmental challenges to me they're not just doom and gloom. I think that they are opportunities. They're opportunities to be engaged in civilizational challenges and to be engaged in something larger than ourselves. And so much of our education and so much of our views these days are, well, there's an economic recession and I've got to do everything I can to get a job, and I'm not putting jobs down at all. But in my program, we tend to get students who've been out in the marketplace for a number of years, and they come back and they say, I don't feel like I'm alive. All I'm doing is pushing paper to get my paycheck. And they come back because they actually want to do something larger than themselves. And so I see environmentalism as tragic as this sort of, the big picture is, what's that bumper sticker? If you're not paying attention, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. I mean, I think there's something to that. But I think, though, that the other flip side of that is that outrage can be engaged in really meaningful ways. And not just environment, but whatever your normative commitment is, whether it's human rights or peace or poverty, but to invest ourselves in something larger than our little game, I think is, for me, what life's about. And so I would hope that that's a message that comes through. But thank you.